In part 1 of my conversation with Nicole Baldinu, we learned about how she scaled her business and how she actually learned about business without having any prior background to it at all. In this part, we will actually get to the business, understand how she runs a $1 million company, what goes into remote work, her insights from it, her insights from customer interactions, how she aces them, and more importantly, her insights from her failures and what she's learned from them. If you missed part 1, you will find the link somewhere around. Don't forget to listen to that as well, because that will give you more context about who Nicole is, what her background has been. And now let's get to business. Nicole, I now want to talk about business. Now, I came across one of your discussions with Omar himself. It was probably an old podcast, and I was listening to it. And it was pretty relevant for this time as well, because it was about remote work. And, you shared your 5 tips for remote work. And then I noticed one thing. This podcast was 6 years old. So this was released in 2014, I guess. Now, what I want to ask from you, the world went remote probably after COVID. Like, it took a COVID to realize that, you can have a remote team and you can work without offices. For you and Omar, it's been like from the very beginning, you've been working with remote teams from all around the world since past 6 years, since probably I do not even know what remote work is. I really want to know from you. Now there are different companies which have popped up in this space. Now you're a senior in remote work, right? So what do you think these juniors in remote work are doing wrong? And as a senior, what do you want to tell them that, this is what you're doing wrong? You need to work this way. I'm more experienced. So yeah.
Oh gosh. I don't know what they're doing wrong necessarily. I think what makes our team work as a remote team is that over communication that we talked about at the beginning. And because I have heard some people say, I suppose if you're going to find something that people do wrong, is that lack of communication, that lack of checking in, telling their VA or someone on their team one time to do something or a task that's required, and then not checking in, not setting the milestones, not setting the expectations, and then just expecting them to do it. And then, 1 week passes, 2 week passes, even a month passes, and they realize, hang on a second, where was that thing that I asked so-and-so to do? Where is it? They never got back to me, because they're not in the habit of that constant communication. And what I mean by constant communication is definitely setting up a system. And there are so many apps and tools now, right? We use Basecamp as our example. People use Slack. There's so many, right? Just setting up a system and leading by example. So, leading those first conversations and chats. And then when someone replies, just putting an emoji if you haven't got time or if you've read it, to acknowledge that a message has been received. So just these little habits to make people understand that we are still talking, we are still communicating, even though we are on different, continents, different parts of the world. You have an opportunity to talk to someone pretty much every day, especially when you're across time zones. There's always going to be someone, depending on how big your team is, there might be someone on your time zone at any time, right? And so if you set that example of hey, checking in, how's your morning, or happy Monday. When I say happy Monday, it's still Sunday for some people. So I know that only people who, it's Monday for them are going to see that message and going to go, hey, yeah, happy Monday too. So I think communication is a big thing, and just realizing that if you expect your team to, execute on a task, that you really have to be clear as to, what you want them to do, when you want it by, what are the milestones, what are the check-ins, so that you don't turn around 3 months later and they haven't done anything. Actually, they haven't even been working. And, you hear these stories, right? They haven't even been working. And that's the horror story, right? Because I feel like the flip side is also very, very real with remote work. And is that sometimes people overwork, and you have to be mindful, that your team is taking time off. So just like companies and in-person, offices will have holidays and paid leave and all of that, you set all that stuff up for your remote team as well, so that they're getting a break, they're rested, and you're making sure that they're not overworked as well. So a little bit of a flip side. Gosh, I could talk about remote work forever. It's going to be a whole segment.
No, but I can understand. As I told you, you're a senior in this. You have a lot of experience, and that's why you'll have a lot of insights as well. Nicole, I also wanted to know from you if there are any, like, if you can just give me maybe 2-3 examples of some processes that you've strictly kept in place. So I read this somewhere that, for example, even when somebody, and maybe these are the times when you were communicating strictly over email, but even when it's an email, there was a consistency in the subject line. So if it's an EOD email, that you have to, sort of get back to it before this day ends and things like that. So there was consistency in the subject line. Is there, like, if you can share 2-3 processes right now, which you strictly sort of follow to have this communication in place?
Gosh, you're reminding me of that episode. I think I even referred to Skype at that time. I'm like, what? Skype? Who's using Skype Slack anymore? Yes. There was no Slack.
There was no Basecamp.
There was no Basecamp. You're right. That's a really old episode. Oh my gosh, we should go and update that. So yeah, because right now our team does their end of day reports, but Basecamp has a feature which is team check-in, right? Yes. What did you work on today? You can ask 3 questions. So it's pretty much the exact same thing, right? That was in email. In email, you're saying, hey, Anna, just tell me what you worked on today and what you're going to be working on tomorrow. It was an email, that would be the EOD. Now on Basecamp, it's just a different tool. It now has its place in the check-in. And so they do the EOD there. So definitely when you're engaging in and using a new tool, and I really believe in not using too many tools. So for example, we don't use Slack anymore. We just use Basecamp. So I think one of the things to keep in mind is to reduce the number of tools that your team has to log into, has to check in, because it can be overwhelming. And then once you pick a tool, then you organize it for your team. So, and you set the tone for, like, okay, the campfire is just for our chats. The docs and files, this is where you put these types of things. The message board is for this. And once, the team starts to see how it's used, it's like organizing an office, right? Where you're going to put the filing cabinets, where you're going to put the desks. Yeah. It's literally the same thing. You're just doing it online. Like, you want to make things easy. You don't want people having to look for things in a million different places. So you streamline where you locate documents and when you tell people to put documents and so on and so forth. So I think sometimes people might feel like, oh my gosh, I've got to do all this online. It's so different to in real world, but you can just transfer those same practices of a real, office and all of that and just do it online. And it's actually not that different.
That's so true, because I also feel, the creators of all these apps have taken all these, like, all of our issues into concern, and they've created this for us. So it's pretty funny, because I'm also that person who's a little tool aversive, and, I would really have, like, all my doubts and all my, apprehensions with these tools. And then I eventually realized that the creators have taken all my concerns into mind. Yeah. That's pretty true, because even we use Basecamp, and I can completely relate with the part that, you have a specific section for files, or you tell the team that, this is the section where we say have informal chats. This is the section where we have all these documents, and we just have to put it there and not anywhere else. And it becomes super easy, even when you're not talking every day on the phone, or you don't have frequent meetings. Just work like that.
Yeah, and meetings too are definitely something that need to be very, like, it needs to have a healthy balance, right? Because in person, you tend to have those conversations, those interactions that are very spontaneous, and it's hard to replicate that online, right? So you do have to set those weekly meetings, or we do a monthly all hands as well. And, I know a lot of people think like, oh, meetings, another meeting, but if you find the right balance and you strike the right balance for the number of people on your team, and the amount of times you want to connect, it's really quite healthy, because it does really build rapport, and there's that consistency, and it's up to you to be consistent. So if you have to cancel a meeting, then you have to reschedule it. You don't just let, meetings get canceled. So just the same way, again, that it happens in real life, you just transpose it to the online space as well.
Got it. I'm afraid, Nicole, I'm that person who would be like, oh shit, another meeting. But I realized you have to really put yourself out there and maybe be there for your team at least. And there are some things which can be only communicated through calls. But what COVID has also changed, a small belief system was that a lot can also be communicated without a meeting or a call as well.
For sure.
And it's just you valuing your time and even the other person's time.
Absolutely.
So I've heard even you talking about documentation a bit, and I want you to go there as well.
So recording processes like standard operating procedures. Yeah. So everything that we do, you want to be able to hand it over to somebody else. Maybe a teammate goes on maternity leave, or maybe that team grows and there's more people that now need to learn that operation, that procedure. So we definitely started to document a lot of our processes. We have things like a knowledge base and the training for the different teams. And we started to do that fairly early on, just because it made it so easy every time we had to repeat the process, to just go, well, here's the playbook, here's the outline. And if you need to update it. So definitely having things documented is really, really important.
I remember how you also said that, it probably takes a 10-minute process. It takes like an hour to write, but it saves so many hours in the future. That's pretty well put.
And you want to delegate that, sometimes depending on, the size of your business and where you're at, you may be writing those first processes, which is so boring to write. Like, let's admit it. We don't want to do that. Like, it's pretty boring. But, we recognize that it's an obligation that we have to do because it, helps your business run better. So at that point, it's time to maybe hire someone it doesn't have to be full-time. It could be part-time. It could be hourly, to help you, document and outline those processes.
Got it. Now, shifting from remote work, Nicole, I wanted to talk about how, this is something that I heard that you love talking to your customers, and that's something you do very frequently, even when the company is like $1 million company right now. What have your insights been over there? Because I'm sure, and now that I've understood you're such a ardent learner, I'm sure you must have developed a process to it as well, because it's all about asking the right questions to your users as well, right? Like, if you ask questions which have a monosyllabic reply, maybe they will give you a yes or no reply. And it also has to not be according to your biases. If you just ask them, do you like WebinarNinja? They'll probably just say yes. But yes, how do you frame these questions? How do you make sure that you get actually valuable insights from your interaction with your customers?
I'm not going to pretend I'm the expert on this, but I'll save everybody the guesswork. I have a friend, her name is Michelle Hansen. She wrote a book called Deploy Empathy. Okay. It has a subtitle, but this book, Deploy Empathy, has scripts. It has a framework. It is so easy to understand and implement right away if you are somebody that needs to start talking to your customers. And you're talking, like you said, you hit the nail on the head, where you have to, you can't just ask the same questions for every situation. It's not going to make sense. If you're asking for feedback or a validation of an idea that you have, that's very different from a conversation that, maybe is a support conversation where someone's had a bad experience. So in this book, Michelle actually gives you the scripts, the questions, the words to ask in these different scenarios. And that was an invaluable resource for me, because I basically hadn't had that experience of talking to customers, say, as much as Omar has, because he does the webinars and he does the member webinars, the sales webinars. So he's got a lot of that interaction with the customers, which has been awesome. That is part of our business. It's foundational that we are constantly getting feedback. But then when it came for me to do very specific interviews with customers to validate a product that we're working on, I had to ask very specific questions. I actually had to talk very, very little, which is what you end up like. I'm talking a lot now, but on those interviews, it's the customer, it's the user who is doing 95% of the talking, which is incredible. And she's got even tips in there on how to close, like to ask the last question before you're closing the interview. And I'll just say one other thing. About doing customer interviews, they are game changing. Even if you just interview 5 people, the insights you're going to get from talking to 5 of your customers, is like a company that's doing multiple millions and has an R&D team and whatever, and all these, resources that you don't think as a small startup you could compete with. I can promise you it's going to give you a leg up on that competition. So it's so powerful. I'm super passionate about doing customer interviews because I do think it can really change the trajectory, and it can change, the experience that your customers have with your product and your company.
I can totally see your passion out of this, out of talking about customer.
Oh, you have to interview Michelle. She's amazing, and her expertise and wealth on the knowledge is incredible.
Got it. I will. And I have this is one of my favorite questions. So I think Arvid Kahl as well, and he had come on this podcast like a couple of episodes earlier. Like he was actually the first person I interviewed. And this was the question I asked him as well. And I love asking this question because I sort of am looking an answer to this, which is there's a very famous Henry Ford quote out there, which is, if he would have asked people what they want, they would have just said faster horses. Mm-hmm. And where do you think is the fine line between you asking your customers for a lot of feedback or suggestion versus you coming out of your own, sort of innovative and creative head and saying that, I think this is what they need, even though they're not saying it. Where do you think is the fine line, or what do you ask, what do you not ask to them?
Oh, I think product people have a field day with that quote, don't they? It can be such a divisive quote.
I know.
I think your customers will give you a lot more than you think. There's another great book called Demand Side Sales, which really talks about the journey that a customer has been on and really understanding their history before they even get to that buying decision and purchasing your product. You might think it's just on that day they showed up to a webinar and they decided to buy because you convinced them or it sounded like a good idea. That's not the case. Often what happens is so much has happened in that person's life that might seem like it has, nothing to do with that buying decision, but actually has a lot to do with that buying decision. And so talking to customers really unpacks a lot of the more maybe historical stuff that you're not seeing from just like, oh, why are you buying this shampoo? Oh, because my hair needs a wash. There's probably a lot more that went into that decision, something that person saw, something they read, something they feel insecure about from a long time that's led to them actually choosing that product. Probably butchering it, but I think there's a ton of value. And I think really, if you don't believe me, I think just talk to one customer.
Got it. Cool. Nicole, for the last part of this round, I really want to understand and want to learn from your failures. So was there a business decision that you took and you were like very confident about it? And if you can share anything about that, and you were very confident about it and it bombed, really badly. And I really want to learn from your failures, specifically in business.
Oh gosh, there's so many. That sounds really terrible. There's so many failures amongst the wins. Yeah, I have no problem in sharing failures. I'm just trying to think what would be the most valuable. I mean, there was the time that I suppose we thought that before Webinar Ninja was a software, it was actually a book. We wrote a guide called the DIY Webinar Guide, because we just thought people wanted the how to, put together and create everything on yourself in a DIY style, right? Which we know DIY takes 100 times longer than here's the tool, here's the actual thing in a box that you need. And, that was a very interesting lesson that actually, was the precursor to the software, because when we spent all that time writing the book, even creating supplementary material like videos and handouts and so much work went into it that after we released it, we got 2 sales and one was a credit card fraud. So we really just got, 1 sale from it. It was such a hard lesson to learn that actually people don't want a long-winded way to do something. They want the tool. They want the solution. They want it faster, right? That's what you end up learning when you talk to customers. Like, how can I get something done faster and easier? And so, that was one of the lessons that we learned. before we actually built the app. And through that, we made actually like some video content, like a video promotion for that really failed. We thought it was great. It was funny. We were kind of doing a parody of 80s videos. And we thought everyone would understand the joke, and nobody understood the joke. We got terrible feedback about it. So it's like, okay, let's go back to the drawing board and start again. But you have to have those experiences. Otherwise, you're always afraid of failing.
Totally. I mean, it's not a failure. It's just a learning. And probably Webinar Ninja wouldn't have existed if that worked.
Exactly.
So now, like, if I'm just going through the Webinar Ninja trajectory, which is, see, initially you tried to do a DIY book and then it did not work. And then you thought, okay, let's maybe build a tool. Now that's some investment in terms of time, in terms of a little bit of money, etc. Did you have customers before it? Like, how did you validate this idea, number one? And how did you have your first set of, say, how they say 10 to 100 loyal customers and fans? How did you get into that trajectory then?
So at the time, we had launched the $100 MBA, and that was a community that we were trying to get members to. So, we had some members from the launch, and then we were slowly trying to get new members. So Omar started running these webinars every week to teach a business concept, to teach a workshop, to attract members into the $100 MBA. And I think we're talking now 2014. At the time, there were not as many solutions as there are now. He was putting it all together with a whole bunch of different tools. And it would take him hours to put it all together, because he had the chat, the landing page, the video stream, all of that. That's where the DIY came from. It's like, here, this is how you can do it. But then he thought, okay, he has a little bit of coding and development skills, very little, but he had enough to kind of start putting something together with the help of just a freelance developer. So he recruited someone to help him put something together that was a very basic version that would help him run the webinars a lot more quickly each week. And so we had members and we had students in the $100 MBA who would attend these workshops. And I think it was one of these students, or it could have been a new student, who asked him what he was using to run the software, to run the webinar on, And he just said, look, it's something I've just put together. And then somebody asked on that, can I buy it? And it's that buying question that gave him the idea, okay, maybe there is something here that is, of value. So there was a bit of a validation there, but really the validation came from him putting together some Photoshop designs of, this is what the software would look like. This is what it's going to do. If you buy at this price, you'll get the first version of it as a lifetime member. And so, we set a limit of how many spots would be sold in a certain amount of time. And we sold out in, I think it was, the first one was 48 hours. And the second time we did it was 24 hours. So that validated, and it was like 150 spots, 250 spots. So we had like a core group of people that put their money on something that was literally a promise. It wasn't available yet. And I think it took us 6 months before we actually delivered the first version. So that validation process went through the failed DIY webinar guide, the live question, hey, you've got something, this looks interesting. Okay, will you pay for it? It doesn't exist. Yeah, we'll pay for it. Okay. That was that process to get Webinar Ninja up and running.
I love that part of the story where, it was a problem that he himself faced, and he developed a solution for himself, only to realize that it's not him who's alone facing this problem. And it's a very similar story that even Arvid had, when they developed their product, their software, which was exactly something like this, that, his wife had a problem and then they developed a sort of workaround solution for themselves, only to realize that, so many people need it. And it's just, you hit it by serendipity, but it's so nice to hear these stories.
Yeah. Oh, it's awesome. They're great people.
So this was part 2 of my conversation with Nicole Baldinu, co-founder of WebinarNinja, $1 million company. In part 3, we come to the best part of the conversation, which is the Madfire round, technically a rapid fire round, in which we asked her questions ranging from her favorite books to movies to life philosophies, etc. It'll be a short, quick part, but it will be equally insightful. Don't forget to watch part 3 as well.